The first pope of the TV age. I mean, this was TV's golden age in the late 50s and early 60s, and he was the first pope who arrived in people's living rooms all around the world via the TV screen. And that's another connection between these three men, that they have all known how to play that instrument in a way that makes the papacy accessible and immediately relevant.
Yeah, part of that is natural. It's just their character, isn't it? But part of it is that, you know, they receive the kind of enthusiasm from the crowd. I saw that with John Paul II many times, that he needed to be out with the people and needed to receive.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I remember you and I talking at one stage that if you really wanted to hasten John Paul's demise, strap him into a desk, you know, and refuse to let him get out, because you and I covered papal trips towards the end of his papacy, and we all worried going in about how frail and weak and tired he seemed. And time after time, what we saw is that he was stronger by the end of the trip than he was at the beginning, because he drew energy from the people.
And I think something like that is what Pope Francis is doing as well, by not wanting to live in the papal palace, by wanting to live with neighbors, by wanting to get out as much as possible. Let's remember that John the 23rd was one of the first to go into the hospitals, to go to prisons. That's something that Pope Francis emulates as well, isn't it?
Yeah, Francis says over and over that he wants the church to get out of the sacristy, which is the area where priests get dressed before Mass. He wants them to get out of the sacristy and into the streets. These are all three popes of the streets, in the sense that, you know, they ended the kind of splendid isolation of the papacy. You know, remember famously in the 19th century, the popes declared themselves prisoners of the Vatican. Well, these guys were not anybody's prisoners. John the 23rd, John Paul II, and Francis all are men who very much know how to connect with ordinary people, which is why, of course, we see the kind of massive turnout that we're witnessing in the streets of Rome here today.
Yes, and we'll just take a look now at the Mass as we begin the formal part of the Mass, which is in Latin, with the Gospel in Latin and Greek. From the Gospel of John, has to do with the doubting Thomas, the famous story.
Well, John Paul II used to talk about the church needing to breathe with both lungs, by which he meant its Western and its Eastern traditions, its Latin and its Greek traditions. So in that, it too, therefore, is a symbol of unity and universality.
Yes. And in the Gospel of John, of course, the doubting Thomas was the one who had to put his hand in the side of Jesus' wound in order to believe. So it has to do with believing in miracles, in some sense.
That's right, and we will also hear a reading from the Acts of the Apostles, and it's worth remembering that Catholics believe that their bishops, and certainly their popes, are successors of those early apostles that Christ called to lead the church. We talk about apostolic succession, this kind of unbroken chain over 2,000 years, of which all three of these popes, John the 23rd, John Paul II, and now Pope Francis, participate in that succession of the apostles.
Delia Gallagher and John Allen there know exactly what they're talking about, our Vatican experts just outside Vatican City, giving us some great context and analysis as we watch the ending of the canonization of two popes becoming saints, and now Mass has just begun there in Vatican Square. 150 cardinals, some 1,500 bishops, there's a couple thousand priests, in addition to the estimated 1 million people who have gathered there in Vatican City to be a part of today's event. In fact, we have our Ben Wiedemann deployed amongst the crowd there in St. Peter's Square. He's joining us over the phone. Ben, I'm not sure how well you can hear me. Give us a sense of the atmosphere where you are, how people are feeling.
The atmosphere is very solemn. I haven't seen this square packed like this since the election of Pope Francis earlier last year. What we have here in St. Peter's Square are people from, it seems, almost everywhere on earth, a very strong Polish contingent. And certainly when the moment came when Pope Francis announced that John Paul II and John the 23rd were now officially saints, I did see several people quietly weeping as they took in that news. But certainly people are sort of, it's a very solemn atmosphere. They're watching the proceedings. Oftentimes when Pope Francis comes out to speak, there's soft applause from the crowd. There was applause when they saw Pope Benedict XVI, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI as well. But as I said, this place is jam-packed, not only St. Peter's Square, but all the roads leading up to the square as well. It's full of people who've been here before sunrise this morning.
Okay, Ben Wiedemann there live for us in the thick of it all with the crowds, and as he was reporting, a very emotional moment for many of the faithful who have traveled here to witness this historic double canonization of saints on just one day. Just a few moments ago, as this canonization ceremony was taking place, we also saw the presentation of the relics, one of which was presented by a woman who received the miracle of Saint John Paul II, Floribeth Mora from Costa Rica. She said that she was cured of an aneurysm after she prayed to John Paul II to intercede on her behalf with God, and she was cured. Again, a very poignant and unprecedented moment here. We also heard from Delia. Speaking to the people in the crowds, she met some marathon runners from Poland who ran to St. Peter's Square in Vatican City to witness this historical moment.
I thought that was absolutely incredible.
It is quite incredible that they're that committed to be here on this day. So as you'd imagine, this is a very emotional and solemn time as people there gather to honor two rock star popes, Pope John Paul II and John the 23rd.
And Delia telling us that the message here, if there's one overarching theme, is one of mercy, that Pope Francis seems to be showing and demonstrating with all of these acts, even with acts that he's taken during this past year, his first as Pope, whether it's washing people's feet, calling nuns to see how they are. He spoke with a woman, called her in Argentina last week, a woman married to a divorced man, saying you can still be a part of the church even though it goes against some of the rules. But really his message seems to be with this recognizing the two pillars of the Catholic Church together, and then also being alongside Pope Emeritus Benedict and showing they continue a warm relationship, seems to be underscoring that message of mercy and togetherness.
Yeah, Pope Francis also breaking with tradition with this canonization ceremony as well. And as you'd imagine, people on social media are tweeting their favorite quotes from the popes being made saints today. I want to show you some of those. Twitter using peace and joy. It's quoting John Paul II. An excuse is worse and more terrible than a lie, for an excuse is a lie guarded. Another Twitter user has tweeted a quote from John the 23rd. We must unite, not divide, for we are all children of one true God. And as we heard from John Allen, another theme today is a message of unity. Now, Mark Hart has this to say about the two popes. Two courageous souls who answered the Spirit's call to breathe life into cultures of death. It truly is cause for celebration. Now, the unprecedented double canonization brings together the three most popular leaders of the Catholic Church of the past century.
That's right. Let's bring back in our analysts there just outside Vatican City. Delia Gallagher and John Allen standing by for us, watching all of this. Our Ben Wiedemann is in the crowd. He didn't pull the lucky card you both pulled and got the comfy seats, but he's there among the crowd saying it's quite solemn. A large number of people from Poland he's noticing as well. And this is a remarkable day for the people of Poland. John, Delia? They may be unable to...
You now, we're just listening to the... I can hear you now, Errol, yes. And we're just listening to the beginning of the Gospel, which is being sung in Latin and Greek. It's from the Gospel of John. It has to do with the doubting Thomas, when Jesus appears to his apostles, and one of them, Thomas, doesn't believe it's him, and he says, "Put your hand in my wounds." And this goes back to that theme of mercy and of miracles. John?
And also having to do, we were talking earlier about the relics and the importance of physical contact. Well, of course, Thomas, the story of Thomas is about somebody who wanted physical contact, in this case with Christ, in order to make sure that this was really him. And I think it does say something about the need that even though faith in some ways is a spiritual and ethereal notion, there's something in the Catholic mind that wants that physical, tangible reality and connection in order to bring it home.
Yeah, and I think that was also part of John Paul II's attraction, that he had a very physical presence. Certainly you felt that when you were in his presence, but there was always a mystical side to John Paul II, I thought. You know, I mean, he was a poet and a writer, and I think a kind of mystic, i.e. a poet who lived in a religious context, and something about that, he himself really believed in saints.
That's the thing. I think John Paul II projected a profound, deep, sincere faith that was sort of contagious. And you are right about the mystical dimension of Karol Wojtyła, the man who became John Paul II. I mean, you'll remember, of course, that on May 13th, 1981, he was shot in St. Peter's Square by a Turkish gunman, which also happened to be the Catholic Church's feast of Our Lady of Fatima. John Paul was profoundly convinced that the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Fatima, kept him alive that day. And on the one-year anniversary of that event, he went to the shrine of Fatima and placed the bullet that doctors had taken out of his rib cage, placed it in the crown of the statue of the Virgin Fatima to thank her for his intercession. And people saw the depth of his own faith, and I think that's part of why so many Catholics would think of him as a role model in holiness.
And talking about the importance of today, which, as you mentioned, is a feast day that John Paul II himself instituted, the Feast of Divine Mercy. Well, that whole thing started because of a vision of a Polish nun who the Vatican banned in the 1960s, her writing and her visions, and it was Karol Wojtyła, as Archbishop of Krakow, who insisted with the Vatican that he wanted them to reconsider this woman's visions. And of course, once he became Pope, she became a saint, and he instituted this feast day.
Yes, which illustrates the old wisdom that it's good to be Pope. But, you know, sainthood procedures sometimes are also exercises in rehabilitation. I mean, let's remember, you know, the famed Italian Capuchin stigmatic Padre Pio, probably the most beloved saint in the 20th century in this country, you know, was investigated 20-some times by his own religious order and by the Vatican and by his own bishop, and yet, of course, was vindicated when he was made a saint. So the point is that, you know, during someone's life, they may be a controversial figure, but, you know, until the final word is spoken, the jury is still out.
Point also being the Vatican can also be quite skeptical when they want
Yes, that's exactly right.
Errol, Amaranth?
It's great listening to you both, Delia and John. You're giving such great insight into the specifics of the significance of today and what really the message the Church is trying to send out. But let's talk about some of the challenges facing the Church, not least among them, of course, these allegations of sexual abuse, which have really dogged the Church for the past few years. A UN panel even issuing a report blaming the Church for protecting those accused of abuse. What's your take on how Pope Francis has handled this very difficult and sensitive issue?
Clearly, the child sexual abuse scandals in Catholicism had been one of the most important streams of criticism, particularly about the canonization of John Paul II. Critics of John Paul would argue that he allowed the scandals to sort of metastasize and didn't really engage them. You know, defenders will say that the scandal sort of exploded by the time his health was already deteriorating, and then perhaps it was unrealistic to expect a more energetic response. In any event, you asked Earl about how Pope Francis has responded. Pope Francis recently created a new commission, the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, intended to lead the charge for the Catholic Church in terms of the cleanup from the sex abuse scandals. One of the members of that commission is Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston, the American who would be seen as a real reformer on the sex abuse front. Francis also named an Irish victim of clerical abuse, a woman by the name of Mary Collins, who has been a stern critic of the Church, and so it's interesting that Francis wanted to bring her into the fold and make her part of the conversation. Actually, of the 8 members of this commission, 4 of them are women, and he's given this commission his clear support. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out, but clearly this is a pope who is committed to continuing the reform effort.
So clearly the canonization of John Paul II has not been without controversy. He leaves behind a complicated legacy, if you will. So what does it mean to be a saint then?
Well, Amara, that that's something that a lot of people ask. You know, does it mean you have to be perfect? Of course, it doesn't mean you've led a perfect life. The Catholic Church doesn't believe anybody's perfect. There's original sin and many sins after the original one. It's not a question of a perfect life for the Catholic Church. It's a question of a virtuous life and a heroically virtuous life, as they put it. And in particular, with regard to popes, they say it's not a judgment on the entire papacy and on the decisions that were made during that papacy, which could have been for better or for worse, but it is a judgment on the Pope himself and the example of Christian life which he set for the rest of the world.
Yeah, that's right, Delia. What Vatican officials will always say is that we're canonizing a pope, not canonizing a papacy. And they would be the first to acknowledge that, you know, popes have to make all kinds of judgment calls and policy decisions and personnel appointments that don't involve their infallibility. You're not obliged to believe that they do all of that perfectly. The point about a canonization is that despite whatever failures in judgment, whatever policy mistakes may have been made, and despite their own personal human limits, these were people who strove to live a holy life and who inspired others to do the same. Now, if the test is the capacity to inspire others, I would say that the crowd we're seeing here today is probably one good piece of evidence that John the 23rd and John Paul II passed the test.
And of course, the official definition of a saint is somebody who's in heaven, who enjoys the beatific vision, who is able to see face to face with God. You remember in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo depicted that creation of Adam and God looking at each other. That's the idea that once you die, and if you are in heaven, eventually you will enjoy this beatific vision. And that is the reason why someone can pray to them for their intercession, because it's not the saint that does the miracle, according to the Catholic Church. It's God that does the miracle through the intercession of the saint. Amara?
Yeah, that's a good point. Being a saint does not mean that you are perfect or a reflection of your papacy. I want to ask you this because we have been seeing Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI there in the crowd here for this historic ceremony, and it was Pope Benedict XVI who actually fast-tracked John Paul II's canonization. Tell us more about that, and why did he do that?
Well, I mean, look, in theory, Amara, sainthood is supposed to be the most democratic process in the Catholic Church. It is supposed to begin with what traditionally we call a cult, which means a kind of grassroots popular conviction that a particular figure lived a holy life, and then officialdom only comes in sort of after the fact to ratify that grassroots verdict. Now, sometimes, to be honest, it's a little hard to find that grassroots devotion. But with John Paul II, there's no question about it. I mean, we remember 9 years ago being in this space and listening to those vast crowds thunder over and over again, Santo Subito, meaning sainthood now. So in a sense, you know, the people had spoken, and I think Benedict XVI waived the 5-year waiting period in response to that. The other point worth remembering is that in the conclave 9 years ago that elected Benedict to the papacy, the cardinals before the vote had circulated a petition among themselves asking that whoever would be elected pope would waive the waiting period for John Paul II and move forward immediately to sainthood. So in that sense, Benedict was also performing a collegial act, meaning he was respecting the wishes of his fellow cardinals.
Yeah, I think Benedict had no choice. I mean, I think he wanted to do it anyway, but certainly with the response from the people and from the cardinals, he was really doing what everyone just expected him to do. Nonetheless, the process still took 9 years.
Well, I mean, that's the comedy of this. You know, we experts spend time talking about the fast-track process. You ask the typical person in the street today, their question is going to be, why did it take this long?
Well, they've got to go through everything John Paul ever wrote. I mean, imagine that. And talk to all the heads of state that he met, talk to a lot of his neighbors, talk to everybody that he knew. They go through quite a number of interviews of people to see if there was anything that might have been contrary to him setting a Christian example.
Yeah, that's right. There is a complicated procedure to declare someone a saint. You don't just get out of bed in the morning and do it. begins, as you say, with collecting testimony, and then, of course, typically we get into the phase of waiting for miracles. Church law normally requires one miracle for beatification and one for canonization, although, in this case, of course, once again illustrating that it's good to be Pope, Pope Francis decided that with John the 23rd, since he didn't have any doubt the guy is a saint and is in heaven enjoying the beatific vision with God, he waived that requirement for a second miracle in order to make it possible that you could stage this sort of double play canonization ceremony here today, bringing John the 23rd and John Paul II together.
And on that note, we're talking about breaking away from tradition in terms of this canonization ceremony. And John the 23rd had one miracle, and I understand that you're supposed to have two miracles to become a saint. So why was this requirement waived, and what kind of precedent, I guess, does it set?
Well, I think, Amara, that part of the reason the requirement was waived was because they asked Pope Francis to do it. You know, Pope John the 23rd has been waiting since 1966 for his canonization, so that wasn't any kind of a fast track for him. And the people that were in charge of his cause said it's the 50th anniversary of Vatican II. It's the 50th anniversary of the death of John the 23rd. Pope Francis, would it be an opportune time after 50 years to actually do this? And of course, the Pope has great admiration for John the 23rd for a number of reasons, and I think he had no hesitation in seeing the opportunity, as we've mentioned, of putting John the 23rd together with John Paul II. John the 23rd, who opened the Second Vatican Council, John Paul II, who was one of the last with Benedict XVI to participate in that council. So also a kind of bridge and a historic moment for the Church of Vatican II. You know, we kind of at the end of an era now with Pope Benedict, Pope Emeritus Benedict, because he was one of the last ones to have attended that council.
Yeah, although on the subject of miracles, I mean, it's probably also important to say that Pope Francis has also set aside the miracle requirement in a couple of cases of members of his own Jesuit order that he has recently declared saints. You know, basically, I think, reading between the lines, I think what you see in Pope Francis is that in what he would consider, not that he would use this language, but what he would see as slam dunk cases, that is cases in which someone's personal sanctity is just blindingly obvious, that he does not intend to be hobbled by necessarily waiting for the formal process to reach conclusion if he thinks that there are particularly good pastoral reasons for going ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen it before with Pope Francis, that when it comes to the rules, he's willing to break the rules if that means that it will help people, encourage people, will give out his message. He's willing, in some circumstances, to look past some of the rules.
Delia Gallagher there and John Allen, our Vatican experts, just outside Vatican City, giving us some great analysis. Amra Walker and myself, Errol Barnett, are here at CNN Center, bringing you live pictures from the Vatican as two popes become saints. At this moment, we understand that some Mass has gotten underway. They're concluding the chanting in Latin and Greek, and next we understand the Pope's homily will begin. As soon as we see that unfold, we'll bring it to you live. Ben Wiedemann is there in Vatican City amongst the crowds. He noted many people from Poland making a long journey there. Some even marathon runners ran from Poland to be a part of today's unprecedented occasion. These live pictures you're seeing now coming to us from Krakow. And if we can bring back in Delia and John, because I want to talk about Pope Francis and his new style. The Vatican is not an institution that changes quickly. How would you describe Pope Francis's approach to bringing some form of change? We've already mentioned the 8-person panel to look into allegations of sexual abuse, for example.
Well, you know, we do typically say around here that the Vatican thinks in centuries. I mean, the working motto tends to be, talk to me on Wednesday and I'll get back to you in 300 years. You know, obviously, Francis has a somewhat more abbreviated sense of how long it should take to get things done. But actually, you know, each one of the three popes that we're sort of celebrating here today, that is John the 23rd and John Paul II, who are being made saints, and Francis, who is leading the ceremony, all of them in their own ways were revolutionaries. You know, John the 23rd took this very stuffy, formal, aloof, kind of isolated institution, and here's this frumpy, roly-poly son of Italian sharecroppers who becomes the world's favorite uncle. John Paul II, I mean, the idea of being Pope used to be that the world came to you. I mean, here's a Pope who took 104 trips to 129 countries, seen in the flesh by more people than any other figure in the history of the planet. And Pope Francis is certainly a maverick in his own way, but he is hardly, Delia, the first Pope to break the mold.
No, I think he's quite a radical. I mean, from the very moment he chose his name, we should have all been alerted to the agenda. I mean, nobody had ever chosen Francis as a Pope before. And after one of the most radical saints in the Catholic Church, I mean, St. Francis had a comfortable life there in Assisi, and he left it all to go walking barefoot among the hills and talking to birds. And, and this is a hugely radical saint for poverty. And so really the whole agenda of Francis was kind of set when he chose his name.
And not only was it radical, it was gutsy, because the truth of it is, and you're absolutely right, how iconic a name Francis is in the Catholic imagination. It evokes humility and simplicity, a love for the poor, a closeness to the people, spurning ostentation and all of that. And if you are not prepared to walk that talk, then taking that name is a huge roll of the dice. I mean, it was a whole program of governance in a word. But what we've seen from Francis over the first year is he's walking the talk.
He's walking the talk, and I think he's very radical in spirit. Now, does that translate into radicalness in change in church teaching, for example, or in the way the church is organized or administered? And that's a question that I think is still outstanding, but we see that he tries to walk, I think, a fine line between those people in the church who would like to be more traditional, stay with the more conservative side, and also embracing a more liberal outlook, certainly a more pastoral outlook.
Sure, although we certainly see from a Pope that one area where you can take it to the bank he wants change is actually in governance, particularly here in the Vatican. That is, he wants the church to be more modern, more transparent, more accountable in the way it does its business. You and I both know he just created a brand new kind of ministry for finance here, trying to get the Vatican's financial house in order because it has been rocked by scandals in the Vatican Bank and so on. He put a tough-as-nails Australian cardinal by the name of Cardinal George Pell in charge of it, and that certainly rocked the boat around here because this is a significant departure from the way business has been done at the past. I mean, there is no way to threaten the old guard more than taking away the power of the purse, and that is in effect what Francis has done. So he clearly at that level is a change agent.
And I do get the sense, John, that everybody is sort of on edge waiting to see what he's going to do next. I mean, from cardinals on to the Catholics in the pew.
Vatican officials who get out of bed in the morning, in sort of a cold sweat, wondering what the new earthquake is going to be that's going to go off today. So this clearly is a Pope who is shaking things up.
And a Pope who was very popular. And John, I heard you describe this event to be a Catholic Mardi Gras on steroids when it comes to the crowds and the excitement. So it's clearly evident that these are two very beloved and wildly popular popes we're talking about, and not to mention Pope Francis himself.
Well, I mean, that's absolutely right. I mean, you've got the two superstar popes of the second half of the 20th century being canonized by the superstar pope of the early 21st century. I mean, listen, if it were just John the 23rd here today, we would probably have close to 1 million screaming Italians. I mean, if it were just John Paul II, we would have the same number of screaming Poles. Francis himself is drawing crowds that are 3 or 4 times larger than we were accustomed to. So you put all three of these magnets for humanity together. I mean, this is a remarkable thing that we are seeing here today.
Yeah, I think it's no coincidence that all three were Time Magazine's Men of the Year. They all have that personal